tank is good. Big guard, which isn't that much. He said he never would have made it if he's the ground.
He's pretty entertaining. We would have missed him.
Yeah.
Good evening, folks. Can you all hear me?
No, it's not on.
Nope. Hear me now?
Yep.
All right. Welcome. Thank you for coming to tonight's presentation by Colonel Schwarz, who's going to be speaking about tank destroyers in World War II, as if you didn't already know that. I just have a quick few announcements before we get started. Thursday, October 17th at 7 p.m., Dr. Gregory Sumner will be talking about the role and events that Detroit played during the Second World War, based on his book of the same name. If you would like to get a copy of his book in advance, just go see any librarian. We'd be happy to get that book for you and order it for you. On November 21st, that's also Thursday at 6:30, last year's very popular speaker, former paratrooper and historian Stephen Mrozek, returns to speak about Operation Market Garden, the gamble in Holland that was a bridge too far. And then on Thursday, December 12th at 7 p.m., popular museum curator Chris Cosley from the Michigan Military and Technical Society in East Point returns to speak about a variety of military-related technologies that were either developed or manufactured right here in Michigan during World War II. So, and it's kind of a little bit of a follow-up to Dr. Sumner's one here next month. So hopefully you can all come out for that if you would be interested. And let me give you just a real quick brief summary of Colonel Schwarz. Fred Schwarz is from Toledo, Ohio, where he enlisted in the Ohio Army National Guard as a combat engineer in 1977. He received his commission as a second lieutenant of infantry from Ohio University ROTC in 1981, serving 1 year in the Ohio Guard before reporting to active duty in 82. From 1982 to 1993, Colonel Schwarz served in the 9th Infantry Division, 2nd Infantry Division, and the 3rd Armored Division. He had overseas tours in Korea, Germany, and France. After a tour as the threat analyst at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, he left active duty and entered the Army Reserve. Colonel Schwarz retired from the Army Reserve in May of 2011 after 34 years of military service. In his civilian career, he was the supervisory foreign intelligence officer for the U.S. Army TACOM Life Cycle Management Command in Warren, Michigan. His team of analysts provided intelligence support to all U.S. Army ground vehicle and weapons acquisition programs. He retired from TACOM in 2015. And with that, here's Colonel Schwarz.
Thank you, Dave, for that kind introduction. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Woods and give another talk on World War II. Last year we talked on the Sherman tank. Today we're going to look at tank destroyers. Anybody out there served in tank destroyers in World War II? Believe me, I've been surprised by that. Every now and then someone goes, yes, I was. Anybody know about tank destroyers in World War II?
My next door neighbor is growing up with the commander.
Okay. All right, why a journey? When I sat down to do this, I found out this subject was bigger than just the tank destroyers. This was a large effort in World War II. As a matter of fact, the Army wanted 220 battalions of tank destroyers. They ended up fielding 70. Most of them went to Europe. That's still a large amount, considering there's about 1,000 men, 700 to 1,000 men in a battalion. So that was a huge force. And right at the end of the war, they got rid of tank destroyers. So they used them for 4 years, and then got rid of them. So there's always been a conventional wisdom that the tank destroyer concept was a failure, or it was kind of a successful failure, or it was something that was an okay idea, but we really didn't need it. So instead of looking at it in that aspect, I thought, well, let's take a look at this as a journey of how the Army develops a fighting concept and equips it with equipment. And then it becomes a little more interesting, especially in the small amount of time they had to do that. So we'll take a look and try to answer these questions as we go through this tonight. So consider, and I used to do this work, I used to support capability development at TACOM. This is the current day way of doing it. Now that's a lot of words up there, but basically what that says is the Army goes out there and says, hey, we need to do something. We need a capability to fight. how do we do that? Then they look at the force and they go, can we already do it? And if not, then you have what's called a capability gap. They write the requirements. They then come up with a doctrine on how to fight it, and they make things to equip the force to be able to do that. That's essentially what happened in World War II, but not in the methodical way that the Army does it now. Some people think they do it a little too methodical now, too much of a process. But back then, they basically did this. The Army goes, we need to do something. We'll come up with a concept, and then they went to the ordnance people and said, build me something. And the ordnance people ran off, designed it, and sent it to the factories and got it built. The need. Well, what happened in 1939? Anybody know? What happened to Poland? Yeah, they were overrun. What happened to France? Yeah, both Poland and France were basically fighting World War I. A largely infantry army. The Poles had some tanks, small ones, but they were still on the concept of infantry, and their mobility came with cavalry on horses. The French had tanks, but they were in the middle of transitioning their tank doctrine from an infantry support force to an actual armored force, and they hadn't fully developed it, and they got caught, and the Germans overran them. Plus there was something very important. The Germans put radios in all their tanks. The French and the Russians didn't, and that made probably the biggest difference, because they could say, hey, maneuver left, and they maneuvered left. And everybody knew it. But what happened was two large armies. The Polish army was pretty large. The French was the largest army in the world, and it was overrun in weeks. And the U.S. Army looked at this and went, what happened? Well, looking at what they knew would happen, what they could tell would happen, and what German propaganda was saying, it was all these tanks that were rushing, breaking through the lines and going deep and going after big objectives, and the Army went, we can't stop these guys because we don't have anything to stop them. So they sat down and they tried to figure out how they're going to stop tanks. And remember, we really didn't have any tanks at the time either. They were arguing over who was going to run tanks in the U.S. Army in 1939. Was it going to be the infantry people? Was it going to be the artillery people? Was it going to be a new force called the Armored Force? That's what it ended up being. They didn't even know what their tank doctrine was going to be. So we didn't even know how to fight with tanks, let alone how to fight against tanks. So there was a great need. What happened? There was a capability gap. We had nothing to stop tanks. So the first concept was, we'll make a bunch of anti-tank guns, we'll give them to the infantry, and the infantry will dig in, they'll have their line, and when the enemy tanks come, they'll shoot at them and win. Well, that's what the French did. That works for the first of a couple lead tanks, but after a while, once you get broke through, there's nothing that can stop the tanks that kept on going, because what's with a gun? It sits there. You can't move it once it's in place, or it's very hard to. So they started arguing and started trying to figure out, what do we need to do this? And General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces, he would not accept a passive defense to fight tanks. He didn't think it was going to work. So, in 1941, General Marshall considered a highly mobile anti-tank and anti-aircraft units. The anti-aircraft is a whole other story, but these were separate units that would be able to move around the battlefield to meet threat. And that's what started the idea of the separate tank destroyer doctrine. But again, they were arguing who within the Army was going to command this. Now, if you understand the United States Army, it's not just one big army. It's a bunch of separate organizations within it. The infantry guys think they know everything. The armor guys think they know everything. The artillery guys think they can blow up everything. And they all say, I can do it. Give me the money, and I will make it happen. And it always comes down to money. And in 1939 and 1940, how much money was the United States spending on its army? Very little. That's why we didn't have tanks. That's why we were training with wooden guns. We just weren't spending the money. We were like, what, the 18th largest army in the world at the time. Most of our force was in the National Guard, believe it or not. It was not in the active force. So they argued over who should handle it. Now the Brits, they put it in the artillery. The Germans put in the artillery and tanks, and then later followed our idea. And the Army argued about it, and originally the infantry people said, what's funny is the infantry, remember this, the commander of the infantry center said, you know what, we'll just make tanks that can fight other tanks. And everyone went, nah, you can't do that, our tanks are tiny. They got this little tiny gun on it, it's not going to work. So they argued some more, and they came up with this concept of a separate anti-tank force. Now, this is what we were facing in 1940. These are not the Panthers and the Tigers and the King Tigers that we actually will meet in 1944 over in Europe. These were the tanks the German Army had and the one that the Japanese Army had at the top. Their most armored tank was the Mark IV up here in the corner. But most of their tanks were Mark IIIs, the Mark IIs, and to have enough, they used these Czech-built tanks after they took over Czechoslovakia. This had a low-velocity 75mm gun. It was an infantry support tank. Their main tank-killing tank and exploiting tank was this one. The Mark III had a 37mm gun on it. This had the same gun. This had a puny 20mm gun and a machine gun. Those were the tanks, and they were very lightly armored, believe it or not. The 37mm gun could knock out every one of these tanks at about 500 meters, which is about your average engagement range at the time. The Japanese had a small tank. This was the Type 95 Hago tank, and the Japanese never really progressed beyond the light tank because they weren't doing big armored battles in the Pacific. They were using them as infantry support. And what's interesting about this picture, this is the tank that came out in 1936. It's being surrendered in 1945 to the Australians. They used it throughout the war. So the threat in the Pacific never really changed. But as you'll see, the threat in Europe changed considerably over time. So the United States came up with this. They took the German gun and they copied it. They didn't pay for a license. They didn't do anything like that. They flat out copied it. And this is the 37mm anti-tank gun. My father served on one of these in World War II. It actually was an excellent gun. It was very accurate. It was mobile. Soldiers could move it because it's small. Problem is, though, as tanks got bigger, it could not penetrate the armor with that. By 1941, it was already obsolete. We put it into service in 1940, and a year later, it was obsolete. It soldiered on as an infantry support weapon because it had an excellent canister round. That fires a bunch of ball bearings out of it. It was like a big shotgun. Was excellent in that thing. But by the time we got it into service, it really was already behind the times. So that's how we were going to counter tanks, was with this little guy. In 1940, this was the U.S. tank destroyer. Okay? Didn't exist. Didn't have it. Didn't really know what it was. We were arguing about it. Are we going to make bigger guns, like put them on two wheels and tow them around? Or are we going to develop a self-propelled one? There was a big argument. Leslie McNair, he said, I want towed guns, because you can hide them. And tow guns are really inexpensive, cost a couple $1,000s. He says you take a $2,000 or $3,000 gun and you destroy a $30,000 tank with it. Remember that, okay? So he thought that was a great idea. The commander of the fledgling tank destroyer command, who right now in 1940 was nothing but a concept, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce, who would later become a major general, he said, I want something that's highly mobile and fast with a good gun. That's what he wanted, and he got his way. All right, there's a difference. You've heard of anti-tank, right? And you've heard of tank destroyer. What's the difference? Anybody know? All right, there is a difference. This is my definition. This is not an official definition. The anti-tank is a defensive concept, and it's a supporting role. Anti-tank is a concept where you support your infantry force with a bunch of guns that can kill a tank. And you give them the infantry, they employ them in their defense. And it is as mobile as an infantryman. How fast does an infantryman move? Anybody here was an infantryman? Infantryman moves this fast. He walks, okay? So you don't need tracks, you don't need wheels, you don't need a vehicle. So the tow gun works. So that's what this is. This is a 57mm anti-tank gun. Tank destroyer doctrine was a whole different concept. The idea was, instead of standing up in the front line and trying to win the battle, slugging it out, you'll sit back behind terrain and you wait for the tanks to start moving. When the tanks start moving, you send out reconnaissance and you find them, and then you counterattack them in the flank. Or you get to take high ground and you shoot down at them, and you hit them offensively. It was a counteroffensive, a counterattack. That's the concept. Very aggressive, mobile, it moves. So they've got to be fast or faster than the tank. That's the key. And then you have to have reconnaissance assets to be able to find where the tanks are and to come up with a plan of where they're going so you can find the terrain to be able to shoot them from. And that was the whole concept of the motto was seek, strike, destroy. You go out, find them, you strike at them, and you kill them. That was the concept of the tank destroyer. Very aggressive doctrine. Now, you got to understand, in the 1940s, early 1940s, the U.S. Army moved two ways. You walked or you rode a horse. The whole concept of moving on a tracked vehicle was something that was really new to the United States Army. And a lot of people didn't get it. The commander of cavalry, he rejected the whole armor concept. General Hare, he went to his death writing about how great the horse was. And he demanded that there would still be horses in the Army. We still had two fully equipped cavalry divisions in 1940. And one of them was in the, part of them was in the Philippines, where the last cavalry charge of the U.S. Army ever occurred, was during the defense in February 1942. So that mentality was still there. Little did he pay attention to the poor Polish cavalrymen that were machine gunned by the Germans, because they make an easy target. Now the horse was gone, and some people just couldn't figure that out. So just understand, you know, the mobility concept of a tracked vehicle was really something new. So we came up with this new doctrine, and it was a very aggressive doctrine. It was so aggressive when you read the manuals from 1942, they talked about aggressive spirit, the soldiers must seek out the enemy, they must go find them. That in 1944 they toned that down because too many guys were getting killed because they were too aggressive. I thought that was really interesting. But they were very, very much into the aggressive spirit, a highly trained force. And this is the part I think the tank destroyer commanded very well. In less than 18 months, they developed, one, they moved from Maryland to Fort Hood, Texas, Camp Hood. That's why Camp Hood exists to this day, is because of the tank destroyer command. They moved, they set up a command, they developed the doctrine, they designed equipment, and they started training people all in less than 18 months. That's phenomenal when you think about it. Today, to build a combat vehicle in the U.S. Army, it takes 10 years. We were doing it in less than a year. It takes years of arguing in conferences and whatnot to develop doctrine. We did it in 18 months. This was incredible what they came up with. The idea was that they would be an independent force that would work closely with the infantry and the armor. They would have vigorous and sustained reconnaissance, and this is the key. Reconnaissance was the key. You gotta find the enemy, you gotta know where they're at. So they developed reconnaissance vehicles in order to do this, and radios, and that's another thing. Radio was so important to this. The idea is you would intercept the enemy tank, you'd move to a firing position, you'd shoot at them, then you'd move to another firing position and move again. In order to do that, your vehicle had to be faster than the tank. Therefore, it had to be lighter than the tank. One of the interesting things was, well, okay, that's a kind of defense because you're allowing the enemy to attack you. What happens when you're attacking the enemy? They never really developed it except that, well, you'll support by fire from fire positions or you'll guard the flanks. And that ends up being one of the problems of tank destroyers in the long run, because we did most of the war on the offense, not on the defense. And the tank destroyers really, people couldn't really figure out what to do with them, and we'll see that later. So that was the idea, and this was all written in FM 18-5, Tactical Employment of Tank Destroyer Unit, and later on I'll tell you, if you want to read that manual, how to get it. It's online. Good as day. It's pretty neat.
Awesome.
Okay, in 1941, they had a series of anti-tank conferences. And this is how they brought together the different branches, and they sat down and said, how are we going to do this? First, they came up with the idea that we still will need anti-tank companies for the infantry regiments. Each infantry regiment will continue to have an anti-tank company. And that was left up to the infantry to figure out. That had nothing to do with tank destroyers. And they ended up developing their own gun for that, based on the British gun. They did, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce was established a planning branch, came up with this tank destroyer command concept. and said, we will have independent anti-tank battalions, which later became tank destroyer battalions at the infantry division, and then we will come up with tank destroyers as independent units. Now, we didn't just do this in a vacuum, okay? We didn't just go, okay, on paper, this looks good, let's make it happen. They went to the field and tested this concept. Everyone hear about the Louisiana maneuvers? Do you know where the Louisiana maneuvers occurred? In Tennessee. That they actually did, they were in Tennessee, Louisiana, and North and South Carolina, but they're called the Louisiana maneuvers. My father was actually on these. In the first one in Tennessee, the 2nd Armored Division went right through the infantry. The infantry had no anti-tank assets, they couldn't stop them, and they just broke through every time. All the war gaming done in Tennessee, the tanks won. And that's when the Army went, see, this is really true what the Germans do, okay? So they developed these tank destroyers, units, makeshift ones with cardboard guns, and they went out there and they stopped the tanks from breaking through. That validated the concept. Now, if you go into some General Devers, who ended up being the armor guy, he said, oh, the Empire's cheated. That argument went on and on and on. But in reality, it did show that the tanks could be stopped. So that was giving impetus to this idea of an independent tank destroyer force. And then they actually sent in a fully trained and equipped tank destroyer unit in the North and South Carolina maneuvers, and it destroyed the 1st Armored Division. Okay. Now, nothing got really destroyed. This was all an Empire goes, yeah, you're dead. You know, it's bang, bang, you're dead. You ought to see it. I've been on exercises, and guys get in fist fights. I don't know whether they've been shot or not. So, it really happened. So, but then the Army also started looking at what the Germans were doing in North Africa. The Germans were having success with towed guns against the British, especially the 88mm gun. So mass guns were beginning to come about as the answer. That picture is of a 37mm being pulled by a Jeep during one of the Louisiana maneuvers. So, Tank Destroyer Command was established. General Marshall came up with the name Tank Destroyer. They liked it because that said it all in one mission. Their job is to do nothing but kill tanks. They came up with a tactical and firing center at Fort Meade, Maryland. It wasn't big enough. They needed ranges and they needed land to maneuver, so they went and they purchased land outside of Killeen, Texas. Actually, they knocked on people's door and said, here's your money, get out. I read about it, it was actually kind of sad. There was 7 families that had land going all the way back to the origins of Texas that were in the family, and they lost it to the U.S. government at this time. And then they established this. And at this center, they developed all the training and all the tactical doctrine, and they started training. And they set up an officers' candidate school. They did all this just in months. By the middle of 1942, this was all up and running fully. You can actually go online and find videos on YouTube of some of the training. Kind of neat. So, then this argument finally came to a head. Do we want guns, as one in the top shows? Now that's a German anti-tank gun, but I picked that picture for a reason. What do you see up there? I think it's camouflaged. You know, the anti-tank gun, the Germans built really good ones. They made them really low to the ground. If you hide them and emplace them, you know how the enemy finds out there's an anti-tank gun? When the lead tank blows up. That's what happens. So they're very effective, and if you mass a lot of them, they can put the hurt on a unit. The problem is, though, once they get detected and they start getting hit by artillery, they're vulnerable and they're hard to move out. This is what General Bruce wanted. He wanted a light, compact, very fast, very mobile, self-propelled gun. It's not a tank. It looks like a tank, but it's not a tank. It's very lightly armored, has an open top, has a nice big long gun on it, and it can move. Anybody know what that is? That's an M18 Hellcat, and they made them up in Flint, made by Buick. It's a good Buick product. This did not come out until 1944. But this was what he wanted. This was his goal, was to achieve this. I remember in 1940, you saw the slide, we didn't have anything. So we had to sit down and we had to figure this out. He wins the battle, by the way, that the primary tank destroyer will be self-propelled. But we fielded both. Anyone guess the reason why we ended up fielding towed tank destroyers?
Cost.
Cost, yes. Cost and ease of manufacture. Okay, proposals. This is fun. Now, you could do a 2-hour lecture just on the 30 different prototype tank destroyers that we came up with in 3 years. There's a good book on it called Can Openers. If you're interested in it, look that book up. It's kind of expensive, but it goes into all the different. This is just a couple examples of the different ideas. You notice we have wheeled vehicles. We tried putting the 37 millimeter on a Jeep because the Jeep's very mobile, very small. The gun's very small, but after we put the crew and the ammunition on, the Jeep couldn't get out of its own way. It was too heavy for it, so that didn't work. So we put it on a bigger truck. It didn't work. We took an artillery piece and we put a 3-inch gun on it. That sort of worked. We built the 57 millimeter, but General Bruce didn't like it. The Russians did. This ended up serving in the Russian army, this vehicle, and they really liked it. We took the light tank and we put a big gun on it, but the gun was too big. The biggest disaster was the M5. That was built in Cleveland by Cleveland Tractors. And right after Pearl Harbor, we really didn't have a tank destroyer yet, so we did one really fast. The guys in Cleveland goes, oh yeah, we can put that on. The thing caught fire. It didn't maneuver well, but it was small, and it could hide really well. So that's what kept it kind of going for a while. Then when General Bruce went out and looked at it, after they type classified it and were about to put it in production, he goes, I am not going to put American soldiers on this thing. So it didn't happen after a couple $1 million spent. If it wasn't for wartime, that would have been a procurement scandal. So there were plenty of this. There's plenty more. If you're really interested, I suggest that getting that book. The guy does a chapter on all the different ones. It's an amazing. It's amazing in 4 years how many we tried to make. Okay, the first tank destroyer was the M3 gun. We hooked it up to a Jeep. And we sent it out to the force, and we used it. It looks funny on that side, but that's actually an advantage. You can move that with just a couple guys. They might not like it, but well.
You can just about lift it with that many guys.
Yeah, it's not a big heavy piece, and it could hide, and it was accurate. It just wasn't big enough. Then we went to the 3-inch M5 gun. General Bruce knew that the 3-inch gun was going to do it. 76.2 millimeter. The Russians were already successfully using a 76.2 millimeter gun. The reason why we liked it was we had a lot of them, and they came from the Navy. This was a Navy gun, and it was an excellent gun, and it could use different ammunition. We just mounted it on an artillery carriage and made it into an anti-tank gun. You know what's interesting? Of all the tank destroyers, this one is still in service in the U.S. Army. Does anyone know where it is in service at? You've seen it. Every one of you have seen it.
California, that's where for salutes.
It's Washington D.C. where it's the Presidential Salute Platoon of the Old Guard Infantry still uses this gun. It's still officially in the U.S. Army. Not as an anti-tank gun or a tank destroyer, but I thought that was interesting. There was 2 problems with this. It was really heavy and really hard to turn and move. I didn't want to put the picture up there because it's kind of gruesome. There's a picture during the Battle of the Bulge where one of these units was caught by Piper's tanks when he broke through. The problem was they came on his flank and the men were trying to turn it in the streets, and it was so heavy they were machine gunned. And there's a picture of them lying there dead around their guns. It was too big. And also, the crew had to stand up because we used an artillery carriage, which made the gun high instead of putting it low to the ground. So it had some problems. It ended up not being very well liked. But we will see, it had some success. Now, the 57, not a tank destroyer. I put a question mark there because there's one gentleman that actually claimed he served in a tank destroyer unit with 57 millimeters. So This was rejected by the Tank Destroyer Command. It says it wasn't big enough. They knew that better German tanks were coming. It was an excellent gun, though. It was developed from the British, it pretty much was the British 6-pounder gun that they used successfully throughout the war in some of their anti-tank units. But this one was always in the infantry units. It was not in tank destroyer units. I just put it up there for information. Okay, remember Bruce wanted a mobile one. Well, this was the first that went into service. It was a 3/4 ton Dodge truck with a 37mm gun plopped on the back. The Dodge truck, which is based on the Power Wagon, excellent vehicle. They're still running to this day. So it was not a bad idea, but this was not intended for combat. This was intended to get guns into the force so they could train on them. So we can get a concept. We did use them in combat, though, in the desert, because you go to war with what you have. The next one was the substitute standard. We knew we wanted a turreted vehicle. We knew we wanted a track. You got to remember, though, we were still developing the M3 Lee tank at the time, and it was having its own design problems. So what we did is we took a half track, and we took the French 1897 field gun from the 1890s, excellent cannon, with a fast breech, very accurate, could shoot all kinds of ammunition, and we put it on a half track. And by the way, that was the same gun that the Sherman tanks gun was developed from. It was the 75mm gun. Excellent gun. Could shoot very far, very accurate, and you could reload it fast. We put on a half track to give us some mobility. These were used in combat, but as soon as the M10 started showing up, we got rid of them. And what did the Army do with them? We gave them to the Marine Corps. And they used them in the Pacific. Okay, this is the first true tracked tank destroyer that General Bruce wanted. And it was based on the Sherman, M4A2 Sherman, the diesel Shermans with the longer body. We took the chassis, not the armor, because this used its own armor of the Sherman. We took light armor, put it on it, put an open top turret, and put a 3-inch naval gun on it. Excellent. The crews loved this vehicle. Absolutely loved it. It could kill tanks, could kill tanks at distance, and because it was based on the Sherman, it was very reliable. Very easy to maintain comparatively to other things. As a matter of fact, when crews were told they were going to switch to the M18, they refused and they wanted to stay with the M10. They really liked this vehicle. There were some different variants. There was the M10A1, which was made here in Detroit by Ford, but it had a gas engine, so they never went overseas. This had a diesel engine, which was funny because the rest of the Army was using gas in the tanks. Excellent, was used all over in the Pacific, Italy, North Africa, and Europe. Okay, this was Bruce's dream. This was the first one designed from the ground up. The one thing that he